We're looking this morning at Exodus 13, 17 through 15:21. I've got a little outline there for you, and hope that it'll facilitate our moving through this this passage. Just a very, very brief review and bit of an introduction. You know, where we were last week, we looked at the last of the 10 plagues, which is, of course, the Passover, in which the firstborn in Egypt, the firstborn of any who don't come under the blood, suffer the judgment of God. It was thinking about this last week, and you know, God, when the angel of death passed over everything, right? He passed over the whole nation, both of Israel and of Egypt. But those who came under the blood were spared that judgment. Those who didn't come under the blood suffered the experience of God's judgment and the loss of the firstborn son. And Passover becomes a defining event, obviously, in the life of Israel. And Passover really initiates the Exodus. And this whole story of Passover and Exodus becomes the dominant story in the history of Israel. It's a bit like a corporate testimony, if you will. Israel looks back, just in the way that Eric shared with us, and looks back however many years now to the time when God did something decisive in his life. I've got a story like that. Many of you have a story like that. Maybe your story isn't quite like mine. You didn't come to a particular moment where you were aware that God was acting decisively, but at some point along the way you became aware that God had acted decisively and had redeemed you and delivered you. For Israel, it was a very decisive thing, Passover. And it's Passover that sets Israel on its way through Exodus in the wilderness, ultimately to the promised land. Number of Psalms make reference to this. I think it's good to recognize this, that this does figure so prominently in Israel's story. Psalm 77, and you can make, I don't do PowerPoint. I don't know how. So I can't project verses up on a screen. And maybe I'm too lazy, or it's just too time consuming for me to put the verses on the piece of paper. But I always feel like if you do a little work, it's good for you. You remember better. So y'all write those verses down, and then you can refer to them later in the day. Psalm 77, verses 16 through 20. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters. Yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. And then just in the next psalm, Psalm 78, verse 12. In the sight of their fathers, he performed wonders in the land of Egypt, in the fields of Zoan. He divided the sea and let them pass through it, and made the waters stand like a heap. In the daytime, he led them with a cloud, and all the night with a fiery light. He split rocks in the wilderness and gave them drink abundantly as from the deep. He made streams come out of rock and caused waters to flow like rivers. And then Psalm 136, verses 10 through 16. To him who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, for his steadfast love endures forever, and brought Israel out from among them, for his steadfast love endures forever, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who divided the Red Sea in two, for his steadfast love endures forever, and made Israel pass through the midst of it, for his steadfast love endures forever, that overthrew Pharaoh and his host in the Red Sea, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who led his people through the wilderness, for his steadfast love endures forever. And then one more, Isaiah chapter 11, verses 10 and following. Isaiah is one of these great messianic passages. It's the passage that describes the shoot that will come forth from the stump of Jesse, the one who will judge in righteousness for the poor and decide for the meek of the earth. That's a passage that's very often read at Advent. But what isn't read typically is the latter part of that chapter, in which God, through Isaiah, uses Passover and Exodus to describe a far greater work, a work that involves not just the recovery of the Jews who have been exiled and banished from their homeland, but actually begins to incorporate the Gentiles or the coastlands. Whenever you see the word coastlands in the prophetic material, most of the time it's a reference to the Gentile nations. But listen to this, because you hear this language of Passover and Exodus now being used by Isaiah to describe something that's even greater. In that day, the root of Jesse shall stand as a signal for the peoples. Of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. In that day, the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea. And then verse 15, and the Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt, and will wave his hand over the river with his scorching breath, and strike it into 7 channels, and will lead his people across in sandals. And there will be a highway from Assyria for the remnant that remains of his people, as there was for Israel when they came up from the land of Egypt. So the author is envisioning, if you will, a second Exodus, an Exodus that involves the recovery of the remnant, the exiled remnant, but also involves the nations. God bringing the nations together with the remnant of Israel in an Exodus-like experience. So it's a defining event in the consciousness of Israel, this whole Passover and Exodus sequence. And just I was thinking about this last week. It impressed me, given not only these passages but many other passages in the Scriptures, that Israel's story, this story of Exodus, this story of Passover and Exodus, it's more than just interesting and fascinating history, which it really is. It's more than that. And it's more than simply a record of God's acts of redemption. It is that, but it's more than that. Israel's story, this record of God bringing deliverance to his people, delivering them out of their bondage, their cruel bondage in Egypt, under the cruel reign of Pharaoh. That story is your story, not just in the sense that we have an historical connection to it, by virtue of our being the spiritual sons of Abraham. But there's this sense in which it really is your story experientially, right? And what you see, what you read as you read this story becomes autobiographical, right? And I wanted to mention just briefly that one of the things the Bible does, and I shared this with our Sunday school this last week, and a number of folks commented to me that it was very helpful, and I don't have time to go into it in the detail that I was able to then. But one of the things that the Bible does is use what is called typology. And typology basically is taking something finite, something human, something limited, and with that finite, human, limited thing points beyond itself to something divine or something heavenly, something way beyond the thing in itself. And I've listed these 5 words that are used in the scriptures themselves that when you sort of take them together, give us some understanding of how this idea of typology works. The first of them is shadow. There are some references I'll give you, Hebrews 8:5 and 10:1, and Colossians 2:17. You know what a shadow is? A shadow, if the sun is back here and it's not cloudy, the sun casts a shadow on the ground, but the shadow is not the real thing. The shadow is simply an image of the real thing. The person is the real thing. And the Bible uses that word with respect to certain Old Testament practices and that sort of thing, that they're not the real thing. They point to a greater thing, a more substantive thing. And then the word copy, again, Hebrews 8:5 and 9:23. The idea here, it's a very interesting word in the original. The idea here is that you're looking from below to something above. You're seeing something below. It has a word in it. It's a compound word, but in the word is the idea of seeing and looking from below. So you're looking at something below that's pointing to you to something above, a copy. The thing that is below is a copy of the greater reality above. And then the word parable is used. We all know what a parable is. Jesus teaches in parables. It's probably his favorite teaching technique. That word shows up in Hebrews 9 and 11, verses 19 and in 11, verse 19. And then the word type shows up a couple of places in the New Testament. Romans 5, verse 14. A type is a figure, something that is formed by striking a blow. Okay, by striking a blow or making an impression. And so when letters are sealed with hot wax, the signet ring would be pressed into that wax, and the image of what is on the signet ring would be left in the wax, right? That's a type. That's what that word refers to, is something like that. And Paul in Romans 5, in talking about Adam, refers to Adam as a type of the one to come. See, Adam points beyond himself to someone greater. He's not the end of the story. He's not the substance of the story, the consummation of the story. He's pointing to somebody else, something else. Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 6 and 11, uses this language actually in reference to the Exodus. This language of type or copy, that the story of the Exodus, Israel's wandering through the wilderness in the direction of the promised land, is a copy of a greater story, a type of a greater story. And then the last word basically means counterpart. It's used in Hebrews 9:24, 1 Peter 3:21. It's a word that describes one thing which resembles another, or is a counterpart to another. So different words that the Bible is using to help us get at the idea that there are things in the Scriptures that point beyond themselves. And what I'd suggest to you, and I think I hinted at this last week, is that one of the first things that we learn as we read this story, study this story in Exodus, is that Moses is a type, right? He's a kind of a shadow of a greater reality. He's a copy. He's a parable, And when I say that, don't misunderstand me. Moses really lived. Moses really did lead the people out of their bondage. The Exodus really happened in history. If you get on H.G. Wells' time machine and you go backwards, you'll get there. You'll bump into the Exodus. You'll bump into Moses. These things are a part of our history. They really happened. But there's this sense in which they are a parable. They teach us about something pointing beyond themselves. And Moses is that thing. He is a type. He points beyond himself in the way that Adam did to a greater Moses. And if you think about the story of Moses, so many fascinating things about him, but if you just begin with what I suggested to you last week from Exodus chapter 3, the number of times that God uses the word sent or send. I will send you, I will send you, I will send you. They will know that I have sent you. That name recurs over and over and over again. That word in the Greek is the word from which we get our word apostle. And so Moses, the sent one, is in a sense the first apostle. And when you come to Hebrews 3, the writer of the letter to the Hebrews makes this connection between Moses, the one who was sent by God, confronted in the wilderness, and then sent by God to Egypt, anointed with his Spirit, clothed with his power, commissioned to be a deliverer. The author of the letter to the Hebrews makes this connection, explicit connection between Moses as a type and the fulfillment that you find in Jesus. Hebrews 3 verse 1, therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle first, and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. So the scriptures themselves are making that connection between Moses and Jesus. And you think about what Moses did, and I may be repeating myself from last week, but you think about what Moses did. Moses was commissioned by God, sent by God, clothed with God's power and authority, sent into a particular place. This is beautiful stuff. Sent into a particular place to bring out a particular people and to lead that particular people out of their bondage in Egypt through the wilderness for an extended period of time, ultimately to lead them into the promised land. Now, Moses didn't get to do that, but his successor did, whose name was Joshua, from the Hebrew word for deliverer, right? And the New Testament rendering of the word Joshua, the Hebrew name, is what? Jesus, right? So Moses was the deliverer who delivered them out of their bondage, serving as a type who points to a greater Moses. And then there's this transition to Joshua, who is a deliverer who delivers them into the promised land. So you have two people fulfilling these two functions, one serving as one who delivers out of, the other one who serves as a deliverer delivering into. They converge in the same person, Jesus, who comes into this world commissioned by the Father, clothed with the Father's Spirit, given all authority in heaven and on earth. And what is his mission? Come to a particular place to deliver a particular people out of their bondage, not the cruel oppression of physical bondage under Pharaoh, but the cruel, death-inducing bondage of sin. Delivering them out of sin and leading them through their wilderness over an extended period of time, ultimately to deliver them into their promised land, which is not a temporal or temporary promised land, but is an eternal promised land, a new heaven and a new earth. So you see, as you read them, this may be old news to all of you. I don't know. I guess I'll default to Paul and Peter, who both felt like it was okay to remind their readers of things that they'd heard before. Okay. My point here is that we see in Israel not just some ancient history to which we have some connection, but you actually see that as your story, right? This is your story. This is what God is doing in you and for you through the greater Moses, through the greater Joshua, the Lord Jesus Christ. And so as you see that story, there are some things, and I hope that you'll take great comfort in these things. These are just some things that I've observed reading Matt Newkirk's little commentary, which I think is just wonderful. I don't know if you guys are working that, doing all the filling in the blanks and all that kind of stuff, but that little study guide in Exodus I think is phenomenal, particularly, it's a little editorialization here, particularly the gospel glimpses and theological connections that he makes. It is really fabulous stuff. So I don't get a commission for selling the book. So, although Matt is a friend of mine, interestingly enough, it's really, really helpful. So, these are just some observations that I've gleaned from reading Matt's little study guide, doing some of my own reading. So, as you see this story as your story, there are some things that you learn about God as you find yourself in the midst of the story, right? I mean, brothers, where are we, right? Sean, I'm so grateful for this. I mean, so many times in the year and a half he's been here, he's taken these loving, subtle little shots at the prosperity gospel. And one particular prosperity gospel preacher. I mean, is this really your best life now? Is this really your best life now? It's not my best life now. I know what I had to do on Tuesday. Some of you know what I had to do on Tuesday. You're in the wilderness, brothers. A decisive thing has happened for you. I'm preaching here. A decisive thing has happened for you. God, in sovereign mercy and sovereign grace, through the work of the Lord Jesus Christ, has effected a decisive act and event in your life. And he's brought you out of that bondage. Ephesians 2, you were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh. But verse 4, God, who is rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, has raised you up and seated you with Christ in heavenly places. This decisive thing has happened. So where are you now? You're in the wilderness, guys. I've said to my Sunday school class ad nauseum, they're tired of hearing about it. The reason it's hard for us to realize that we're in the wilderness is because we've lived in a bubble for 2 centuries in this country. We have enjoyed extraordinary blessing in this country as a particular place where the influences of the gospel have run widely and deeply. Are they diminishing now? Yeah, they are. But the influences of the gospel have run widely and deeply in this country. And we've enjoyed all kinds of benefits as a result of that. We've not lived like 99 and 44/100% of our brothers and sisters across the history of the life of the church, from the days of Abraham down to the present. They've lived much more a wilderness existence than we have. But we are in the wilderness. And deep in your bones, you know it. You know this is not your best life now. So you're in the midst of the Exodus. Personally. Individually. So what can you expect in the midst of it? Let me give you these 4 things. I've just painful. Ben said he had 4 hours and 13 minutes of video time left on that camera, so stick around. I've got an hour for each one of these points. Here's what can you expect in the midst of this? Well, here's the first thing. You can expect that God is present. You can expect that God is present. This is a major theme from the point of Passover through the Exodus and through the rest of the history of the people of God until that tragic scene in Ezekiel when the glory departs from the temple. But God is present with his people. Exodus 13, verses 20 to 22. And they moved from Succoth and encamped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. Make a note of this. Just make a note of Exodus 40, verses 34 to 38, which further elaborates the work or the presence of the pillar of fire at night and the cloud by day. What is this pillar of fire and cloud? Well, those are two, as I'm sure you know, two ways in which the presence of God is represented to the people of God. What did Moses encounter in Exodus chapter 3 when he came to the bush? The bush was a burning bush. It's remarkable to reflect upon that. Here is this bush that is on fire, and yet the bush is not consumed. What is that teaching you about God? It's teaching you that God is self-existing and self-sustaining. He does not depend upon anything for his existence. The fire is in the bush, but the bush does not feed the fire. The fire is self-feeding, self-existing, eternal, the way our confession puts it. God is infinite, eternal, and unchanging in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. The fire is one of those symbols of the presence of God. Genesis chapter 15, when God cuts the covenant with Abraham. Abraham slays these animals, lays them in these two sections, one half across from the other, and a smoking fire pot comes down and passes through them. Smoking fire pot. The pillar of fire, every single moment is a reminder to Israel that God is present with them. In the daytime, it's a cloud. What is the cloud? It's the glory cloud. It's not one of those cumulonimbus things that you see, these big puffy white things that we see. No, it's the glory cloud. It's the cloud that descends, Exodus 19, that comes down on the mountain and covers the mountain and veils the glory of God from the people of God. And there's thunder in that cloud, and there's lightning in that cloud. That's the cloud that accompanies Israel. So what is God saying in this? Well, he is present with his people, and this will come to a sort of a penultimate fulfillment, this idea of the presence of God, in the construction of the tabernacle and the temple, right? And as you get into Exodus and then Leviticus and the temple, the tabernacle initially is built. The cloud will fill the Holy of Holies. The cloud will cover the mercy seat where the cherubim face each other, right? The presence of God will be there, that glory cloud, right? And what is God communicating in that? In the holy place, in the tabernacle, with the 12 tribes encamped around the nation, God is communicating to his people that he's with them. He's in their midst. And the same thing happens when the temple, the permanent structure, penultimately permanent, is constructed in Jerusalem. The glory fills the temple, reminding the people again that God is in their midst. He's near to them. He's present with them. And he's present with them through their wilderness wandering. Where does all of this come to fulfillment? Well, it comes to fulfillment in Jesus, right? Jesus, who is the true temple. He's the one who said, pointed to himself and said that he was the temple. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. This building that it took all these years to build, 3 days, you think you can No, idiots. That's not the temple. I'm the temple. Right? And Paul tells us in Colossians that in Jesus, all of the fullness of deity dwelt in bodily form. Right? So the presence of God dwells in Jesus. What does that mean for you and me? Again, Jesus died, raised, ascended to the right hand of the Father, pours out his Spirit, his very own presence upon his church, and promises to his disciples in that upper room discourse that he and the Father will dwell with those who keep his commandments. Dwell with them. Be in them. Right? So now who's the temple? You are. Let me just give you a reference. We don't have time to read it. It's 1 Peter 2, verse 9, where Peter reminds these believers that they are living stones being built into a spiritual house, being built into a temple. You're the temple. United to Jesus, the living stone, you as living stones are a spiritual house where God dwells. Paul reminds the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 6, that they're not their own. They've been bought with a price, that their bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit. Right? So what do you have? I mean, you leave here today, what do you have? You have this assurance that God is not only present with you, following you around, but by his Spirit, he's actually making you his abode. He is with you, number one. Number two, he leads. Exodus 13, 17 through 19. This is sort of implicit, I guess, in what we've already said. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. Just to get the geography of this thing, this is all along the Mediterranean. The short route would have been to follow the coastline right up into the Holy Land, right? But the text tells us that God in his wisdom didn't take them that way because he was afraid that when they saw war, they would want to return to Egypt. It didn't even take war for them to want to return to Egypt. It just took a couple of days without food and water, and they were ready to pack it in and go back to Egypt. But verse 18, God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea, and the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. And then chapter 14, the Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal Zephon. You shall camp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. So here's what God did. He didn't take the shortcut. He took the long route through the wilderness, and he parked the nation facing the Red Sea. He led them to that spot. So they've got the Red Sea in front of them. What do they have behind them? Egypt, Pharaoh's army, warmongering charioteers, right? Has that ever happened in your life? You ever been in a hard spot? Like, man, I've got death in front of me and I got death behind me. How did you get there? I'm jumping to the preaching part real fast here. How did you get there? By mistake? Remember, God dwells with his people. He's present with his people, near to his people, never leaves his people. How did you get to that spot? God didn't disappear. God didn't take his hand off the wheel. God had you in that spot. Maybe you're in that spot today. How did you get there? My now departed and present with the Lord Jesus, old friend R.C. Sproul used to say, was it a maverick molecule that got you in that place? Something outside the control of the God who lives with you and dwells with you? How'd you get there? God led you there. I was reminded of this week, this passage in Jeremiah 29. This letter that is written through Jeremiah and sent to the exiles in Babylon, right? They've seen, the Babylons were not polite people. They learned everything about warfare and how to treat people from the Assyrians, who were the most bloodthirsty and cruel people the planet had yet seen. And the Babylonians were the Assyrians on steroids. These Israelites in Jerusalem had seen pillaging and raping and killing, plundering, and had seen their king have his eyes plucked out right after watching his children slaughtered. And in that letter that God writes through Jeremiah to the exiles in Babylon, he says, I brought you here. Yeah, it's an interesting passage. At the human and horizontal level, Nebuchadnezzar brought you here. But I am the Lord. I brought you here. And I have purpose and plan for you here. And God had purpose and plan for Israel, being stuck where they were. Death in front of them and death behind them. And what was God's purpose in putting them in that place? Number 3, that he might deliver them. That he might put his power on display. That he might act for them. I'd love for you guys to talk about this point around your tables when we conclude. I don't know if it was in Matt's little commentary or someplace else, one of the other resources that I used to prepare for this morning, but it is very significant in Exodus 14, 1 through 14, that God promises that he will act, but then he says to the people, verse 15, why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. So God is there promising that he's going to act. He's going to deliver. But the people are called upon to act as well, aren't they? They've got to dip their toes. They've got to step out in faith into those waters which, apart from the mighty act of God, would swallow them up. And waters in the Scriptures are always places of chaos, right? Genesis 1:1, the primordial waters are chaotic and disordered. And God has to act to bring life out of those disordered and chaotic waters. These waters are going to be disordered and chaotic for the Egyptians in just a few hours. Right? Revelation 21 says that in the day of the new heaven and the new earth, there'll be no more sea. Don't worry, there will be beaches and oceans. The point is, they won't be dangerous. They won't be places of chaos and disorder. These waters in front of these people are terrifying. They can swallow them up. But they got to put their toes in them. They have to act. They have to respond in faith. Right? Based upon God's promise that he will deliver, and that promise is rooted in previous acts of deliverance. They're not being asked to do something unreasonable. They've seen Passover. They've seen God act. They've seen how God inclined the hearts of the Egyptians to give them gold and silver and bronze and precious stones and fabrics. They've seen the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. They've seen these things. God has already acted to rescue them. He's prepared to act again based upon his promise and what he's done in the past. He calls upon them to step forward, right? To trust him. And that was their struggle, and that's my struggle, and that's your struggle in the Christian life, is to believe God and trust God when I'm between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army behind me, when I got death in front of me and death behind me, when it seems like everything is moving in the direction of my absolute annihilation. Those are the moments when God says, trust me. Trust me. I've led you here. I'm with you. I know what I'm doing. So we see that God is present. We see that God leads. And we see here that God delivers. And then finally, and it kills me that I got to stop with this, we see that God wins. That's all expressed in chapter 15. It's a song of deliverance. After Israel passes through the waters, they come out on the other side. They turn this great event into a song of praise, right? And I know that's happened in your life. I know it probably hasn't been anything as dramatic as this. But you've seen God act, and when you see God act and do these works of provision and deliverance, it turns your heart toward him in worship. That's what Sunday mornings really are all about, right? It's looking back over the past week and acknowledging that God has been present, that he's led us, that he's delivered us, and we get together on Sunday mornings to celebrate and give thanks for that, to praise him. That's what happens here. Their hearts are turned in the direction of praise because God wins. He's the mighty warrior who subdues his enemies and the enemies of his people under him. Very interesting that Revelation 15, verses 1 through 4, picks up the language of Exodus 15. Let me just read this and we'll conclude with this. And I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass mingled with fire, and also those who had conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name, standing beside the sea of glass with harps of God in their hands. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and amazing are your deeds, O Lord God the Almighty. Just and true are your ways, O King of the nations. Who will not fear, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. Jesus, through John, takes us back to the Red Sea deliverance and uses the Red Sea deliverance to illustrate a greater deliverance, a greater victory. And it's the victory of God, not over Pharaoh, not over an earthly potentate, but over the ultimate enemy of our souls, the devil of hell himself. It's interesting if you look at an Egyptian headdress. Have you ever noticed this? You know what's prominent on an Egyptian headdress? A snake, a cobra, right? I love it. Genesis 3:15, the serpent crusher, right? Revelation 15, the Song of Moses, points beyond itself to the greater victory that God wins, not as he crushes Pharaoh, but as he crushes the serpent and delivers his people from their bondage in sin and death and from the power of the devil. Right? So, what do we learn? What is our story? What do we learn about our God? He's present, he leads, he delivers, and at the end of the day, he is the one who wins. Take just a few minutes around your tables and talk about a couple of things. Talk about your stories. Maybe share a situation in which God has acted for you recently, right? And shown you yet again that he's with you, that he's faithful. Or talk about the big story. Just interact about this stuff. And I'll close for us in a few minutes. Okay?